Greetings, my good bitches. The name's Francis, cokefrancis. I'm an editor, Twitch streamer, drag artist, and I'm here because, I'm gonna be honest with you, my last couple of videos kind of really bummed me out. To be clear, I don't regret making them by any means. They're about issues that are important to me, and I really needed to get my frustrations over it off of my chest. But way back when I was doing stand-up comedy, one of my biggest pet peeves was when other comics would use their stage time as like their own free therapy session and then told no jokes whatsoever. Hey, listen, LA comedians, you know who you are. Anyway, I felt like I kind of fell into that with my last couple of videos, and I gotta say, doing 2 videos on transphobia back to back was exhausting and very mentally taxing. I can't even begin to tell you how relieved I was when I was finally able to block Joshua Sider on all forms of social media. The world sucks enough as it is right now, and I've honestly been really looking forward to making this video and talking about how cool drag is rather than the people who are trying to make our lives miserable. Drag is a celebration of self-expression and gender, and it's worth celebrating because it's been around way longer than the people trying to demonize it today. So we're gonna take a brief history lesson on drag around the world, and most importantly, look at photographic evidence that we have always been here. And as the title suggests, these pictures go hard. It's kind of wild to think about the fact that without these icons, I wouldn't be able to do what I do now. And I certainly wouldn't be able to announce that this video is sponsored by Aura. With everything else going on in the world right now, it's easy to forget that 2024 saw some major high-profile data breaches, which raises some serious concerns about personal information security. Dell and Ticketmaster have all suffered major data breaches in the year of our Lord 2024, affecting between 2.5 and 560 million customer records, respectively. But worst of all, National Public Data recently announced that they had suffered a breach that compromised, and I cannot possibly stress this to you enough, Lord Baby Jesus in Heaven, over 2.9 billion records used for background checks. Critical personal information like full names, addresses, dates of birth, phone numbers, and social security numbers are all currently available online for free. You are more vulnerable than ever in today's digital landscape, and if you haven't been taking your personal information online seriously, now's the time to change that, just like I did when I started using Aura. Aura monitors your personal data, including your social security number, across billions of data points like the dark web and public court records to alert you about potential identity theft. They also offer up to $5 million in identity theft insurance should the worst case scenario happen. Aura also offers a ton of other features to keep you safe online, including real-time alerts for data breaches, a VPN for secure browsing, data broker opt-out to stop companies from stealing your personal info, a password manager, and more. I'm not leaving myself or my family vulnerable to data breaches, and if you don't want to either, you can use my special link aura.com/queencokefrancis to try 2 weeks for free, which is enough time for Aura to find out if any of your personal information has been exposed. And now, back to our regularly scheduled programming. Drag has existed since theater has existed. It wasn't until pretty recently that drag became what we know it as today, which is a radical form of self-expression that plays on exaggerated aspects of gender. But it goes so unbelievably further than that. Drag isn't about the gender of who's underneath, it's about the gender, or lack thereof, that's being presented. We've come a long way from its origins, which were initially a way to exclude women from the performing arts. And this dates all the way back to ancient Greece. Theater was such a highly respected art form in ancient Greece that it's still referenced today. In ancient Greek society, women were considered inferior to men, and putting them on stage would disrespect the very art of theater. Oh, the humanity. Do keep in mind that this was all the way back in the 5th century BCE. But they couldn't have plays with just male characters. Even back then they knew it would be a total sausage fest. So the male actors would play female characters. The Greek process of cross-dressing was known as proton tragodia, and male actors would wear masks like this very unnerving one right here, wigs, and padding. Even I don't pad. That's dedication. One example was Aristophanes' comedy Lysistrata, where women in Athens were protesting a war by withholding sex from their husbands until the war was over. I think they call it the 4B movement nowadays. On the tragedy end, The Fall of Miletus by Phrynichus featured performances of female characters that were allegedly so moving it brought the audiences to tears. See, the only time I cry at drag shows is when I'm drunk and someone starts lip-syncing to Gloria Gaynor. This tradition carried over into the era of Shakespeare in the 16th century, the one era of theater they actually bothered to tell you about in AP Lit. So there's an age-old myth that this was where the word drag was coined and that it was an acronym for dressed as a girl. And I mean, that totally tracks. I can totally see why people would believe that. But the term drag actually originated in the 19th century. We will get to that in just a moment. So during the same time, Kabuki theater emerged in Japan, and it was originally a female-only discipline with the women playing characters of all genders. But despite the art form itself being founded by a woman, actual icon Izuma no Okuni, women were banned from performing Kabuki in the 17th century due to a moral outcry and allegedly fights that would break out amongst male audience members trying to vie for the actress's attention. And the all-male version of Kabuki was officially born, also known as Onagata. Damn! We were so close! Women were eventually permitted to perform Kabuki again a couple hundred years later, but for a few centuries it was men putting on these shows that were supposedly so erotic and titillating that the performers would be available as prostitutes after the shows. One very notable Onagata was Yoshizawa Ayame, who served so hard that a nobleman fell in love with him and offered to buy him out of his contract. Ayame politely declined the offer and stayed on the stage. Y'all. This diva. So now we're gonna jump to 18th century England and meet Princess Saraphina, who is believed to be the oldest known drag queen. Her real name was John Cooper, but everyone knew her as Princess Saraphina, especially in ye old drag bars, which were called molly houses at the time, and they regularly hosted balls and masquerades. A few centuries later, molly houses actually did still exist, but you would have to get a voicemail so that you would know the address to go to, so that the cops wouldn't sorry. Wrong Molly House. It was a very old rave scene reference. Though it hasn't been confirmed, it's very possible that Princess Saraphina was actually a trans woman, since she wasn't a performer, but rather just a part of John's everyday life. Saraphina worked as a gentleman's servant and ran messages between men. Keep in mind, even though this was supposedly the age of enlightenment, this was still the 1700s, when sodomy was still a punishable offense by death. Molly houses were raided regularly, and the men who frequented them were usually executed. Some would take their own lives after these raids just to avoid that. Can I mention that in a sponsored video? And somehow, still in the face of all of this, they still gathered and formed their own supportive communities. Again, we have always been here. However, there are actually no records of Saraphina ever being arrested and was never actually charged with any crimes. Actually, the only time she was ever seen before a judge was in 1732, when some dick named Tom Gordon stole her male garb clothes. Yes, good bitches, this queen was the accuser. Unfortunately, Tom was acquitted on all charges and she lost the case. But she remained a respected figure to all who knew her. Even though there are no actual pictures of Saraphina, according to her landlady, she would usually wear a long white gown, a red cloak, and frizzy hair. Okay, Miss Red Riding Hood. Moving on to the 19th 19th century, when drag actually became a popular form of entertainment. And most importantly, the camera had finally been invented. My good bitches. This is where the pictures are gonna go really hard. So during this time, men dressing in drag for performances was still seen as more respectable than a woman getting anywhere near a stage. Keep in mind, though, that drag was only acceptable in the context of a performance and was a big bad no-no everywhere else. These two divas you see here are Frederick Park and Ernest Bolton, two gay theater kids turned couple who not only dressed in drag for performances, but out in the open as well, which, of course, made everyone around them co-wake in their little boots. Going by the names Fanny and Stella, these were the first men to walk through the streets of Victorian London in women's clothing. Society was so shooketh that the police launched investigations that were usually only reserved for the most severe crimes, and they still showed up to court in drag as they were charged with conspiracy to commit sodomy. Bless the court's heart for thinking that the sodomy was just a conspiracy. Though this charge came with the maximum penalty of life in prison, they only served about 2 years, but not before taking these glamour shots. So what was going on in the US during this era? In 1885, a cross-dressing singer named Madame Patarini started making waves in Utah of all places. His falsetto was so convincing, in fact, that nobody could have guessed that this definitely biological woman was actually a young man named B. Morris Young, as in Brigham Morris Young, as in son of the ultimate diva of the Latter-day Saints, Brigham Young. Yes, good bitches, even Mormons were cool with drag back then. Madame Patarini even performed at the birthday party of the then president of the LDS Church, Lorenzo Snow. Now, these examples were referred to as just cross-dressing at the time, but the term drag and the types of drag balls that we know and love today also originated at this time. So I'm gonna spend an entire section talking about the very first drag queen in the United States and probably the baddest bitch in US history, William Dorsey Swan. Now, before we get into it, I wanted to bring up that the pictures you see here of this fierce bitch are often attributed to Swan. If you Google him, these are the pictures that show up. But unfortunately, these are not pictures of William Dorsey Swan, and there actually isn't any photographic evidence of him. These are actually pictures of Gregory and Brown, a vaudeville duo from the early 20th century who popularized what's known as the Cakewalk. We'll be touching on them just a little bit later. However, this does tie into the story of William Dorsey Swan, who hosted drag balls where the Cakewalk was regularly performed. And let's be real, these pictures still go hard. It is absolutely criminal that learning about William Dorsey Swan isn't required in history classes, because he was the first to do so many of the things. Swan was born into slavery in Hancock, Maryland in 1858 and was freed by Union soldiers after the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect. Throughout the 1880s and 1890s, Swan organized an entire secret world of drag balls in Washington, D.C., and established the earliest known queer liberation group, not just in the United States, but in the entire world. And, naturally, Swan was known to his friends and the rest of the ball scene as simply the Queen. Really quick though, can you even imagine the charisma, uniqueness, nerve, and talent it would have taken to literally invent drag shows in the 1800s? Can you imagine the amount of ambition and bravery needed to do that after being born into slavery? Are you f***ing kidding me, dude? Most of the ball attendees were men who were also former slaves, meaning they went from that to gathering to dance in silk ball gowns. Now, this is where the term drag was officially coined. It's because these dresses were so extra that they literally dragged across the floor.
And that's where we get the term.
So as cool as this is, most people back then did not think so. So these balls were kept a secret. Attendees were risking their livelihoods and reputations by going to these. And the people who were jailed for doing so would have their names published in all the newspapers. That one lady who looks like Bulby from Jimmy Neutron has been trying to bring back that practice, so Thanks, bitch. So the first time of several that Swan was arrested for doing this was in 1888. According to this report, Swan tried to block the police from entering, saying, quote, "You is no gentleman." According to Swan, his dresses were torn to shreds, and this fight was one of the first documented cases of a queer resistance. In 1896, Swan was falsely charged and sentenced to 10 months in prison for keeping a disorderly house. Nowadays, that would just apply to my office, but back then it meant keeping a brothel. The judge said, quote,
"I would like to send you where you would never again see a man's face, and would then like to rid the city of all other disreputable persons of the same kind. Thieving and petty assaults amount to nothing as compared with the conduct of these people."
Wow, I mean, times have really changed, right? Swan was denied a pardon from then-President Grover Cleveland, but he was the first American citizen to pursue legal action to defend the queer community and their right to organize. Like I said, the first to do so many things. Unfortunately, after Swan was released, he retired from drag and the ball scene, but his brother actually continued to make costumes for the now existing drag community, which wouldn't have been possible had William Dorsey Swan not been the baddest bitch of the 19th century. So this brings us back to Gregory and Brown, the vaudeville duo that I mentioned earlier. These two made waves when they introduced a dance called the Cakewalk to Paris in 1902. The Cakewalk actually first came to be in the mid-1800s on slave plantations, where the winning couple would get a pastry or some other kind of baked good as a prize. The whole point of the Cakewalk was to be very comical and very extra. So naturally, William Dorsey Swan, someone who was born into slavery, incorporated the Cakewalk into many of his drag balls. And just like almost every single aspect of black culture, white people appropriated the Cakewalk for themselves and used it for minstrel shows. As disgusting as this is, there is still a delicious irony in the fact that the reason the Cakewalk was so over the top and comical was because it was a mockery and a caricature of the stiff, prim dancing styles of white slave owners. Just like how there are plenty of people in the MAGA crowd who somehow still haven't figured out that The Boys is making fun of them. Anyway, apparently the Cakewalk absolutely blew the minds of the French, and Louis Lumiere even made a short film about this duo's groundbreaking act. So before we move into the 20th century, if there's one takeaway that I hope you have after watching this, it's knowing that drag in the United States exists because of slaves who rose against their oppressors. This is a fact. So it's now the early 1900s. There's a rise in motion pictures and a decline in theater, and therefore less of a need for men to perform in drag for theater shows. However, people still needed live entertainment, and this is when vaudeville exploded, and drag was a staple for any good, respectable vaudeville show. Again, still more acceptable for men to perform in drag on stage than for women to pursue any kind of acting career. In fact, drag performers actually started to form their own fan bases around this time. Julian Eltinge was undoubtedly America's next drag superstar for the early 1900s. Though he flopped around for a while on Broadway as a comic, audiences especially enjoyed the gender-bending aspects of his performances, and drag ultimately became his calling. I definitely don't relate to that. Nope. Couldn't be me. Julian Eltinge was a big deal and put on a very convincing performance. Many people genuinely believed that he was a real actress, so when he would triumphantly remove his wig at the end of performances, people were shook, but in a good way. Julian was so popular, in fact, that he was able to launch his own fashion and makeup magazine, for biological women, of course. He performed for King Edward VII, he starred in musical musical comedies. He starred in feature films. He became one of the highest paid stage actors of that era. Now, even though Julian was widely respected as a drag superstar, this was only in the context of performance. Out of drag, he intentionally put on this overly macho persona to try and combat the rumors that he was gay. Gays? In our drag shows? In this economy? Drag actually became so accepted at this time that quite a few people felt comfortable enough to dip their toes in. Even Queen F. Scott Fitzgerald performed in drag for a musical he co-wrote, and he served hard in this picture taken in 1916. This paved the way for what became known as the pansy craze in the late 20s and early 30s. The economy had gone to shit and the Great Depression was in full swing, and it was the underground drag clubs in major cities that helped people escape from that, even if just a few hours. Oh no, wait, this was 2022. No, but really, drag and the LGBTQ community were not only accepted during this time, they were celebrated. People loved this shit. The pansy craze gave birth to many other legendary drag performers, like Harry S. Franklin, Ray Bourbon, great name by the way, and Vander Clyde, known to the real ones as Barbette. This bitch would perform death-defying trapeze stunts in full drag, and good lord, I cannot even imagine how painful the wedgies must have been. I'm getting one right now, and I've been sitting for 2 hours. Like Julian Eltinge, Barbette would remove her wig at the end of her performances, and everybody lost their minds, but in a good way. The early 30s saw the rise of more comedic drag acts, like Francis and Lonas, oh, another Francis, and the pioneer of insult comedy, Jean Mullen. Dame Bianca Del Rio, may she rest in peace, and Lady Bunny, may she rest in pieces, would not be here if not for this 6-foot-tall, 200-pound lisping diva who commanded respect in every single room he walked into, all in the span of 25 tragically short years on this planet.
Come on, sugar. Everybody likes you. Why don't you be a good kid, huh?
At one party he performed at, the one and only Tallulah Bankhead tried to out-diva this diva, and he subsequently threw her in a swimming pool. This is what is commonly known as a gay duel. The ball scene that Miss William Dorsey Swan had founded made its way to major cities, and they focused on the more glamorous pageantry side of drag. Unfortunately, the drag boom became hampered in the latter half of the 1930s, when a moral panic around sex crimes rose. Americans had become more reactionary, and this caused drag to be perceived more negatively. Oh no, wait, that was 2022. This picture was taken in 1939 after this queen was arrested for cross-dressing in public. Out of all the pictures I compiled for this video, this one might go the hardest. Same goes for these two keeking in a jail cell in 1946. I think these two pictures speak for themselves. Even though cross-dressing in public was still an arrestable offense, it was still acceptable as a form of theater. When World War II began, soldiers faced a bleak reality. They were scared out of their minds, they had no idea when or if they'd ever see their families again, and morale was very low. The National Theater Conference pushed to authorize drag shows among soldiers, stating that it was, quote, a necessity, not a frill. In 1942, this request was approved, and the USO and the American Red Cross officially began producing soldier-led drag shows worldwide. Now, say you're just a guy being a dude and you're in the army, you probably don't know the first thing about drag. Not to fear, the Army Special Services has you covered. They began distributing blueprint specials, aka everything you wanted to know about drag but were too afraid to ask because you're a dude in the army. They covered everything from choreography to dressmaking patterns to ballet routines that soldiers would perform in dresses and combat boots. At this point in time, there were some factions of women's armed services that were allowed to perform on stage with men, while others were not. The ones who were barred from appearing on stage were still allowed to host classes and workshops that trained these soldiers in the noble art of female impersonation. And yes, of course it is noble, but like, make it make sense, 1940s. One Want to see a picture that goes really hard? This one was censored by the British Ministry of Information because they were worried it would go 1940s viral and project the idea that their military was weak or effeminate, as if being an effeminate man isn't one of the most badass things you can do. These are British troops whose Christmas drag show was so rudely interrupted by air raid sirens, forcing them to stop the show and prepare for battle while in costume. Whether or not they were tucked is still unknown to this day. These shows were a rousing success. Not only did they boost the troops' morales, but the great Irving Berlin began producing soldier-led drag shows, the most successful of which was This Is the Army. In 1942, the show opened to a sold-out crowd at New York's Broadway Theater and raised a ton of money for the Army Emergency Relief Fund. One reviewer said that the actors were, quote, the most beautiful dames on Broadway. It was so successful, in fact, that it was adapted into a feature film in 1943, starring No, not you! Anyone but you! You son of a bitch! God, you just ruined everything, didn't you? Then General Dwight D. Eisenhower was a big fan, saying, quote,
The USO has given an impressive demonstration of the way people in our country of different creeds, races, and economic status can work together when the nation has dedicated itself to an all-out integrated effort.
The armed services at the time were still segregated, but these shows were made with the intention of appealing to both white and black audiences. A month after This Is the Army premiered on Broadway, Germany's Quartermaster Truck Company produced the very first all-black soldier-led drag show called Jumping with Jody, which was like This Is the Army, but I'm assuming that the music and dancing was far superior. Like it canceled for saying that. I can't dance, okay? Can't you tell? It wasn't until the final years of the war that these performances were finally integrated.
Yo! Yo, holy shit!
However, even with the success of these shows, that still didn't change the fact that dressing in drag publicly was still a criminal offense. It was only in very specific contexts that the public could handle looking at a man in a dress without clutching their pearls and fainting like a Victorian lady. So, with the negative attitudes toward drag that were forming in the 1940s, wartime propaganda reassured the public that these shows were just a way to boost soldiers' morale, and that these men were simply performing their patriotic duty by entertaining their peers. In the film adaptation of This Is the Army, the movie ends with these soldiers marching off into war, reinforcing the idea that the whole thing was just a performance. Or, as the people put it, who elected the star of This Is the Army as the president, the good old days.
That's my son, the fourth from the left. I'm about to take a squeeze. Very pretty, isn't it? Yeah.
As much as the United States government has always bitched and moaned about gays in the military, they have always been there. So while these drag shows provided much needed comic relief for all soldiers, regardless of sexual orientation, they sparked an idea in the minds of the gay soldiers of all races to create their own community, their own culture, their own social space that they could make uniquely theirs. And with that, the gay subculture that we know and love today was officially born. All hail all of these queens. I would not be able to do what I'm doing right now if not for all of you bitches. I really enjoyed this one, y'all. I should do this more. Let me know if you want to see more of this too. Anyway, I think we're on a winning streak here, so let's check out the winning comments from the last video. Risa Harris says, "Oh my God. Can we just start calling him by his drag name, Miss Apple Cider, please?" Lumina Red Panda says, "I regret to inform you that the left has canceled Griftmas. We have to say happy hustle days now." And finally, Apocrypha 5363 says, "A racist, an anti-Semite, and a transphobe walk into a bar, and the barman says, 'Hey, aren't you the woman who wrote Harry Potter?' You too could be featured in the next video. Leave a comment below. I will pick my favorite ones and give you a shout shout out next time. If you would like to guarantee your name be featured at the end of every video, please consider joining my Patreon. If you join any of the membership tiers that are conveniently named after Fallout protagonists, your name will be featured at the end of every video. You might also get cool stuff like access to my Discord, behind the scenes content on how I make my wigs, ad-free and uncensored versions of my videos. So if you love my videos and my drag, you can support this channel directly by clicking the link to my Patreon in the description box. If you would like to see me sim for my favorite game characters and get visibly frustrated in real time, please follow me and sometimes my beautiful co-producer Mitchell on Twitch. I stream most Saturday afternoons Pacific Standard Time, and we are still raising money for the Palestinian Children's Relief Fund. If you would like to see even more of my clown mug elsewhere, please consider following me on Instagram or TikTok. My handle for all of the above is at queencokefrancis. If you enjoyed this video and you haven't done so already, please build a time machine and put on your best drag before stepping inside and transporting yourself back to the Salem witch trials. When they inevitably disapprove of it, give them a taste of the future by going ahead and unzipping your pants and dick slapping those like and subscribe buttons as hard as you can. Thank you again to Aura for sponsoring this video, and thank you to all of my patrons and subscribers who have helped my channel grow and thrive the way that it has been. And of course, as always, until next time. Wow, I love doing that with this thing on my hand. Ow.